This is Eric Wilkie and Joel Betts, and we're with Sal Rezaie from Rebel EM podcast and blog. So, welcome, Sal. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, super excited. Rebel EM's been around for a while, and it's kind of a big deal. So, well, before we get there, um, Joel and I both did residency at Maricopa County in Phoenix. That's how some of the contact we get. But I went to medical school at Texas A&M, which I saw that's what you were as well. So, what was your path to medicine, and specifically emergency medicine?
Yeah, I think I've always known medicine is what I wanted to do, and I tend to be the type of person that likes stress, in the sense of I really like to make decisions and run toward the fire, so to speak, as opposed to run away. And I know not everyone is wired that way, and so I kind of knew from high school on that med school was the way I was going. And so all my decisions, everything I did, all the courses I took, everything was to get to med school. Um, when I got to med school, I thought I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon. And after doing my rotations on orthopedics, it was totally different than what I expected it to be. I did not like the OR as much as I thought I would. And there was a lot of, I don't mean this in a negative way, but there was a lot of monotony, a lot of repetition.
Mhm.
And I'm the type of person that likes to not know what's going on. And so for me, emergency medicine was the perfect fit for that. And so the rest is history from there. I mean, med school and then off to residency at East Carolina University, and then emergency medicine was ultimately the residency I chose.
Awesome. Well, Joel. I don't know about you, but yeah, I wanted to be a plastic surgeon. So
Oh,
getting
I
into
didn't know.
yeah, but I had this envisionment of like you're doing all this amazing reconstructive work all the time, and then when you get into the reality of what it was most likely going to be, it's like, well, you know, lips, butts, and boobs, and you know, it wasn't. Yeah, it didn't have the excitement that emergency medicine. So yeah, I totally get it. So what about you,
Yeah.
Joel? Did you were you always EM, or did you have something else?
No, I was in the business world before this, and but I got easily bored, and I looked at anesthesia, but on probably my second day of anesthesia, realized that I did not have the brain for it. I was completely unplugged. The entire rotation, there was only one time where someone started crashing during surgery. I was completely not ready for it because I was zoned out, and I need something to keep me more engaged. And so that's what drove me to emergency medicine, was kind of that constant engagement and never knowing what you're going to get. Sounds a little bit like Sal's idea there. It's like, what's coming around the corner, and you got to be ready for anything. Otherwise, I kind of get zoned out. The monotony was a killer for me too. I did an ortho rotation. Like after the 20th time them giving the same speech about knees, I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I get where you're coming from, Sal, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and after doing my family practice rotation, I really didn't want to see the same patient twice.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Little did you know, right?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. All right. So after residency, did you stay out east, or did you come back to Texas right away, or?
I came back to Texas right away. So I graduated 2010. So I actually did a EM IM combined residency at East
Oh, that's
Carolina.
right.
So I got double boarded. I came back to Texas not because that's what I wanted to do. That's just where the best jobs were available. And so I just ended up coming back to San Antonio, which is where I was born and raised. I started working at University Hospital. I actually split my time. I was probably about 70% EM, 30% IM. I actually worked on the hospitalist service with
Wow.
residents, and then also started the EM residency program at University of Texas at San Antonio. After about, I don't know, 6 to 7 years, what I realized is I went into academics because I enjoyed teaching. And the further along you get in academics, the more responsibilities you get, the more committees you sit on, the more things you have to do. And the one reason I went into academics is because I enjoy teaching. And it was the one thing I was able to do the least of, because there's just no buy down from clinical work. And you just get more and more responsibility. And then you're just kind of married to the job, so to speak. And it wasn't until I came out to the community that I actually was able to really kind of find my stride in education and teaching. Which is kind of ironic because that's not what they teach us in med school and residency. We think if you want to do like academics, you got to do research and you got to go down this promotion and tenure pathway. And I would have to say that couldn't be further from the truth.
Right. It's fascinating to hear, some, just kind of the way that the job changes from what you're envisioned. Like even Rob Orman, like hearing him talk about the job wasn't what you thought and the kind of the stresses. So with Rebel EM, before we kind of move on to how do we survive emergency medicine, and make this a long-term career, where did Rebel EM come from? Like you started that whole thing, so.
It was insecurity, as most things are for me. I remember being a med student, a resident, even a junior faculty, and people would talk about like, oh, we're going to do this because of this paper. We're going to do this because of this research. And I just never really felt like, even with Journal Club, I ever got taught how to break down a paper and whether it's a good one or a bad one. Not that my programs did a bad job. I just think we have all these check boxes we have to meet. And it's like, understand sensitivity and specificity and likelihood ratios and p-values. But they never really got into like real methodology and application at the bedside, right? There was like a disconnect for me. And so I felt really underprepared. And so I did 2 fellowships after I graduated. One was the EMBERS fellowship, which was the Emergency Medicine Basic Research Skills. It's a 1-year fellowship put on by ASEP, just to get a better, I guess, my brain wrapped around basic biostats research, how it happens, different methodologies, etc. And then I also did the ASEP teaching fellowship to just get better at education and teaching. And through the combination of those 2 fellowships was where I kind of got the idea for Rebel EM. I was like, if I'm struggling this much, I'm sure there's other people out there that are struggling with this as well. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but at the end of the day, I want to teach people something, especially as I'm learning. But I also want it to be applicable at the bedside. And funny enough, here we are 11 years later. It's been 11 years since I've been doing Rebel EM. And it's the number one thing people message me all the time is like, when they're on shift, they love going to the site to pull up the study so that they know what they're doing for their patients. And so that's super humbling because I'm not the world's smartest guy, but I work really hard, and so it's humbling that there's others out there that kind of feel the same way.
Yeah, I think the imposter syndrome is big and strong. Like I think if you haven't had that at some point, you're probably a narcissist. But
yeah, I'll just say also, I mean, Sal, it's funny to kind of be talking to you today. A number of years ago, I was put out as a medical director at kind of an outside hospital outside of town, about an hour and a half outside of town. And I had commutes quite a bit. And so what I decided to do was kind of use those commutes for podcasts and trying to hone my skills. And so it really is an honor to talk to you today because I've just listened to you so many times on those podcasts. And I remember that you'd listen to something and then later that week or later that month, you'd be like, oh, I remember this, and I'm sure making those podcasts, you're kind of like, oh, I hope this is doing some good. I hope that this is getting to the bedside. But I'm here to tell you it is getting there. It's getting to the bedside and it's affecting patient care. And so just on behalf of all of the ER docs on long commutes across the country, Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Super humbling, man. Super humbling. I'm just like everyone else, frontline worker, taking care of patients, just trying to do better at his job.
So Sal, so when you started it, I get it. I have these sheets that I make for like vent management with ours, with critical changes and what the next steps are, because I just don't trust myself, right? Um, so I totally get that, where you're trying to be like, all right, how do I build something that's strengthen my position? But I'm sure Rebel EM grew and opened doors or changed things in ways that you didn't anticipate when you started. What would you say was kind of the biggest surprise or the most impactful thing that you've noticed out of all this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me was I don't think I realized the number of opportunities that would become available to me. Getting to speak at national and international conferences, like, hearing from people in Spain and some of these different European countries and how they think they know me because they listen and read to the things that I say and write. And I think it's really just getting to meet more people in our specialty, I would say, is like the biggest thing. And so that's called networking, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the past, we would have to go to a conference and go and
Mhm.
shake hands and schmooze at social events and, try and meet people. And just to be able to say things like, Scott Weingart, Michelle Lynn, Rob Orman, Anand Swaminathan, the list goes on, Mel Herbert, that these people are like my friends.
Right.
They're not just colleagues, they're friends. And would they be friends if I didn't have these opportunities or I didn't have this platform? And so I think that's probably the biggest thing, because I remember being a resident and listening to a lot of these people and reading a lot of the stuff that they were writing, and to now to be able to call them friends is just super amazing. I think that's probably the biggest thing for me, is just the number of friends across the world that I have now.
Yeah. So how did you build the habits? Because to do something successful like Rebel EM, you have to be consistent, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, you have to have a cadence of production. Um, you're a busy guy, right? You've got family and practice and teaching and all the demands. Like, how did you do this so that uh, it it didn't crush you? Like, and to build those habits so that it was successful.
Yeah, so there's two parts to your question. So the first part is just start. A lot of us tend to overthink things and want it to be perfect. Actually, if you go back and listen to my first ever podcast or read my first ever blog post, compared to like what we're doing now, I mean, it's leaps and bounds in terms of how much it's grown, in terms of complexity and in terms of what it offers. And so I would say number one is just start, don't overthink it. There's something to be said for momentum.
Hmm.
And just thinking all you're doing is making excuses and delaying. So that's the first part, is just start. If you have an idea, flush it out as best you can and then just get going. Because you're going to make mistakes along the way, and you're going to learn things that you wish you would have done differently. The second thing is that I don't know. People think I'm on the website 24/7, and I'm not. I'm not. I believe in something called chunking, which is where I chunk blocks of time to work on particular projects in my life, with Rebel EM being one of them. And so, like, at the beginning, obviously, there was more blocks of time that I was spending on it. But then after a while, it starts going on to cruise control. You start getting other contributors and valuable members of the team, and you start
Mhm.
delegating a little bit more. And then, what it turns out is like maybe 2 or 3 times a week for a couple hours, I'll get on the site. And so it's, you got to block time to work on stuff. And we'll talk about this as we talk about self-care, but boundaries are important.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes we don't set good boundaries for ourselves, and we let things bleed into other aspects of our life. And that's where it becomes overwhelming and tends to burn us out and stress us out. And so I've just set times on my calendar that, like, these are the chunks of time that I'm going to work on the site. So it's not a 24/7, 365 type of deal.
So where did you learn chunking?
Um, it was a book by Cal Newport called Deep Work.
Yep.
And it's a phenomenal book. It was kind of a game changer for me after reading that book. Some of his ideas are a little crazy, I would say, but there was, just like anything, like you gotta border on crazy to get the good ideas that work for you. And so that was one of the things he talked about is like flow. Basically where you're like in the groove, like, we've all been there where it's just like things are just flowing in a way that you can't help but want to keep going. And one of the ways you get to that is you limit distractions, because in the world of social media and mobile phones and tablets and laptops, we're all distracted. We're all hyper distracted. And so chunking blocks of time allows you to focus on the one thing you want to focus on without interruptions, which makes you more efficient actually, and makes you better quality in terms of the things you're trying to work on.
Yeah. Well, and this it's probably a segment to kind of the next topic, but yeah, Cal Newport's book. There's also The One Thing, and then one that I read just recently, and it's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Right. It was written by a church pastor, so it's definitely got that sort of slant. So if that's not something you're interested in, that's definitely a theme in the book. But it's got some really solid principles. Like you said, there's so many distractions, so many things that takes away. But all right, so you were at University Hospital, got the residency up and going, or part of the team that got the residency up and going. And then you find yourself, like a lot of people that take an administrative role or senior academic role, it's like you just get swallowed alive. I tell people medicine is the jealous mistress, always wanting more and more of your time, right? And so what kind of led you to be like, all right, I'm stepping away from university, I'm going to a community hospital setting? Like what happened with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was nothing bad. It was just that all the reasons I went into academics were not the things that I was actually doing. I was, in a lot of committee meetings. I was in a lot of like interview season, core curriculum meetings, sepsis team, stroke team, STEMI team, just part of all these different committees. And then, you know how it is. EM is 24/7, 365, anyone, anytime, anywhere. And we don't work banker's hours Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And so you still have to come to these meetings. And I think what ended up ultimately pushing me out was the sleep disruption that was happening, because, you'd work a night shift, you come home, you get a couple hours of sleep, and then you got to come back for a meeting, or you got to come back for interview season. And no buy down clinically, no less nights, no less weekends, no less anything. Like you're still pulling the same weight as everyone else. Yet you have all these additional responsibilities. And I think ultimately it was the sleep deprivation was really starting to impact my personal life. And I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I decided to move on to the community, where I wouldn't have all those responsibilities. And, it was a breath of fresh air. It was one of the most stressful times for me, because I'm a pretty loyal guy. I tend to stick with things I start. I'm not the type of person that hops around. Like there's people that will go toward the money or pick a better job because they think the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, which couldn't be further from the truth. There's always pros and cons to every decision we make. But I think ultimately, if you like pin me down on it, it was all the additional daytime responsibilities with all the nighttime shifts and impacting my sleep, I think is ultimately what pushed me out.
Yeah. And I used to, when I was in my 30s, the people that were complaining about sleep that were in their 50s and 60s, I'm like, come on, man up. Guess what? I'm now in my mid 50s. And I'm like, it is not as easy as it was when I was younger. That's for sure.
Yeah, I would say that we kind of mimic the military kind of mentality a little bit. Like, if you're complaining, there's no cushion, there's no sympathy for anybody when you say, "Oh, I worked a night shift last night, got an hour of sleep, and came in for meetings." Nobody goes, "Oh man, why don't you take the day off?" Or I'll cover your meetings or whatever. And Yeah, I think Sal, that's a really good point. One thing I've noticed, I'm in a regional manager role or regional medical officer role, and one of the things that is hard about that is that you're right. It's like this 24-hour a day thing. There's a problem over at this ER. We've got a patient here. Or we've got this, and it's really never off. So you're never 2 a.m. You're on vacation. You're at a family wedding. Doesn't matter. You are on, and so there's something mentally there that wears you down after a while. Whereas if you're just doing shifts, that also wears you down, but in a different way. It feels like, at least I remember when I was just doing clinical shifts, you do your shift, you hang up your stethoscope, you go home, and unless something catastrophic happens, with a patient you saw, or there's some, issue with your note or something, you're not going to get contacted until you come back in on your next shift. But I think there's something about that sleep deprivation, kind of always being on, kind of always feeling like you need to be available, that wears people down in our field for sure.
I mean, I think what ends up happening is somewhere along the way, I don't know, we all get kind of brainwashed, and we're going to talk more about this, but work should be a subset of life, not a superset of life. But somewhere along the way, as we matriculate through, as we gain more responsibility, work starts to bleed over into everything. And it really does become a superset, which is so not a healthy way to live. And again, we'll come back to this, but it's setting some of those healthy boundaries and feeling no guilt in setting those boundaries. I think is one of the key things we'll talk about a little bit later on. But somehow in medicine, we all get, I don't know if brainwashed is the right word. Maybe it's just our training and the fact that, what we've gone into, which is to help others. We always feel obligated to help others, and we just keep giving and giving and giving. And then who's the last person we always think about? Ourselves. And so that over time, it becomes additive or subtractive, however you want to look at it. And somewhere along the way, I lost track of that, or lost sight of that work is a subset of life, not a superset.
I like that.
Did you have, moving from more of a, clinically dominant role to one that's a little bit more on the administrative side, I didn't think that would be an issue. I didn't believe, or I told myself I didn't believe that my identity was tied up in being a clinical ER doctor. But I was wrong. Like, it was hard. Like, as you transition, like, I was surprised at the difficulties that sort of arose just internally, mentally, when you're like doing that, and just that. My identity was so wrapped up in this one thing that it was a challenge, to adapt. I don't know if you had a similar thing when you did yours.
Sorry, you kind of broke it. You got pixelated. I didn't hear that last part.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I was just talking about how it was, changing roles, and kind of leaving some of the intensive clinical behind. I didn't think my identity was wrapped up in being an ER doctor. But as I started to make that transition, I found that I struggled. I needed to kind of adapt and develop, but kind of letting go of holding that identity tightly was a lot more difficult and mentally taxing than I expected it to be. I don't know if you had a similar experience or not.
Yeah,
kind of transitioning from residency, the big academic, to community based.
I think this is true in life. Like, everybody's looking for the fountain of youth and wants to keep doing the same things. And, I think a healthier way to live is every part of our life is a chapter, and every chapter comes to an end. And that's not the end of the world, because for every chapter that comes to an end, another chapter will start. And I think it's important to realize that we do have a lot of identity tied into what we do for a living. And one of the reasons I've not gotten into more leadership positions is because I remember the taxing nature of being on all these committees and having an administrative role. And the one thing I identify with is like, I'm a clinical guy. Like I want to keep taking care of patients, but I don't want all this other stuff that's like dipping into the rest of my life. Like I want to come in, take care of people, and I want to go home and enjoy my life. And so for me, it was probably the opposite. I felt more taxed when I was in academics. And then when I got out into the community, I felt less taxed. Because I set that boundary for myself of like, I don't want to be a medical director. I don't want to be a program director. I don't want to sit on this committee or that committee. But with that also comes another thing to think about, which is there's something at work that's frustrating you and you're not sitting on committees and not in leadership positions, you're probably not going to be able to impact change very much. So you basically have to decide what's more important to you. And for me, it was, well, the stuff they're deciding in the C-suite doesn't impact me or bother me enough for me to want to do something or invest my time and energy in that. I went to school to take care of people. And so for me, it was the opposite of you, where I got rid of administrative roles. And I just found that to be a lot more liberating.
Yeah. And in my administrative, I'd like to clarify, having been a medical director and sitting on a bajillion committees and, missing Christmas morning with the kids and all that, fortunately, what we've got now is, we sort of retooled our thinking and said, look, I can't change JCO. I can't change the EMR. I can't change HCAPS. But there's some things within our purview that we can really work on to try and improve what it's like to work in the emergency room. So that's where I spend most of my focus, because we've got, 2 facilities in Texas. We've got 14 facilities that we manage in the Phoenix metro area. And so spending my time, it's like, how do we make our physician and our APP lives better to tolerate this, meat grinder that is emergency medicine. And so for me, that I'm having a blast. Like I wake up excited. I, love what I'm doing, but it's different than stroke committee, right? And being on the trauma committee and, dealing with hospital politics. So it's very different than that. So having done that in the past, I'm happy to have that in my rearview mirror.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to work on the things we can work on to make the work environment better, more efficient, happier employees, colleagues, etc. But this is my point, is that we can't control JCO. We can't control the EMR. And everything is focused on making work better. But the reality is that although those things are nice little Band-Aids and patches to help us when we're on shift, it's really the stuff we do between shifts that's more important, that we never get taught. Nobody ever talks to us about it. Everybody just keeps grinding until they've burned the candle at both ends of the stick. And so I'm not against what you're saying. I agree that it is nice, but I'll give you an example. I'm getting crushed at work. We're short staffed. I've seen 30, 40 people in an 8-hour shift. Buying me pizza that I don't have time to eat is not making my shift better.
Doesn't help.
That's insulting, actually. Why don't you come down and help us, like man and woman power, to kind of dilute a little bit the amount of influx that we're all having to take on, right? There's no amount of making things better on shift that's going to fix that. A busy shift is a busy shift. So what we do between shifts, though, is important, because that's all your restorative time. That's the time that allows you to handle those kinds of shifts. So I've done this. Like, it's this concept of micro breaks versus macro breaks. Micro breaks are things you do on shift for like 5 or 10 minutes, like step out of the department, go do some box breathing, make sure you get up and walk around every once in a while. There's things that we do on shift to make the shift, at least from an emotional standpoint, tolerable or bearable. But really it's macro breaks, the things, the hours and days between shifts, things like sleep, diet, exercise, hobbies, family, friends, the list goes on. That's the stuff that re-energizes you to be able to come back and handle that. But somehow the focus is all changed to like fixing things on shift that we can't control. We have no control. I mean, these policies are in place. And I know that sounds maybe a little like rigid, but it's the fact. I mean, tell me there hasn't been a time you've not worked a shift where some policy or something like door to antibiotic time, door to lytics time, door to balloon time. It's become a metric driven, business driven specialty, unfortunately, that will chew you up and spit you out. And so it's really what you do between shifts that allows you to tolerate that or pick a new career.
Right. Well, I'd like to hit a couple things. One is I think the Band-Aid, like what's the typical physician wellness mantras? Like, all right, learn, meditation or whatever. But on shift, when you're feeling the stress and pain, what tools do you have? Right. Those I think are a little bit more limited. You said, there's box breathing is kind of these micro breaks. But a couple things that I think have some impact that we miss a lot is nobody says thank you, right? It's like, or to be honest and be like, you just saw 30 patients in 8 hours, understaffed. That's really difficult. Like, that's amazing. Like, thank you for your dedication. Like, you are very much appreciated for this, And so part of like, we don't have, our view, we don't have our view target. We have documentation goals. Like we want you to document well, because it's important for a variety of reasons, but it's like, you must see X number of patients per hour. Like I've always hated that, because it doesn't handle the situations that you're dealing with. Like, sore throats, great, big abdominal pain workups or ischemic bowel or, like that's very different. But then we try and talk to our people too. It's like, kind of like you're saying, what do you do between these, drinking through the fire hose pieces? So if you were counseling somebody, if you were going back in time and you're going to like, all right, Sal, let me talk to you as you're going into this field. Here are the things that I've learned that have given me that resilience, away from the hospital. And so that's one question. And the other is, you mentioned boundaries, and setting boundaries is easily said, sometimes hard to do. So those two pieces, if you were going to go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say?
There's really three things that I would talk about. One is how we cope with stress. The second is I want to talk about sleep. I don't think sleep gets talked about enough. And then I want to talk about priorities and boundaries, which I think is the biggest piece of those three. So the first thing I'll say when it comes to coping is, in not so many words, it's basically managing or dealing with processing internal and external demands perceived as demanding to us, right? And that's going to be different for every person. There's a subjectivity to that in terms of what we can each tolerate and handle and deal with. What I find is most of us, not all of us, but most of us handle this in a maladaptive way. And that is in one of three forms. It's usually through suppression, which is drugs and alcohol. There's a reason we have a high suicide rate in our specialty and a high amount of psychiatric illness in our specialty because we use things as a crutch to basically suppress all those microaggressions, stress, and trauma that we take on every day from work. The second would be what I call distraction, which is we're on our phones, scrolling through social media, we're on TV, we eat, we work out, we overwork out, we overwork to distract ourselves sometimes so that we don't have to process stuff. And so both of those are unhealthy. The final one, which most of us who are higher functioning do, is what's called compartmentalization, which is we put it in a closet and say, I'll deal with this later. how often do we come back and deal with it later? We just let it continue to compound until the door bursts open. And then now you're hearing all these people talking about burnout, moral injury, and, it's kind of like a buzz phrase now. And so these are just some of the maladaptive ways that we cope with things. And if I could go back and talk to myself, I would say, don't do all these things that are just going to wear you out and drain you. You need to do something more adaptive as opposed to maladaptive, which is called reappraisal, which can be as simple as just talking to family and friends instead of shutting it up and burying it. Go to a therapist. I have no shame in telling you I go to therapy 1 time a week, and it's the best thing I've ever done. I started doing it 2 years ago, and I wish I would have started like when I got out from residency. And it's really nice to actually have an objective viewpoint in terms of being able to talk about a lot of these things in terms of how it makes me feel. And, working on problem solving skills of how do you deal with this stuff? So like emotional growth, mental growth, the things that we kind of learn as we go along life, but nobody ever teaches us in school. So that would be the first thing I would say is like basically realizing that the way we cope with things, and again, this won't apply to everybody, but is not a healthy way. And so finding healthier ways, like I'm not dealing with this correctly. I'm using alcohol as a crutch. I'm just burying it and not dealing with it. I'm wasting my time on social media, whatever it may be that you do. Some form or way, we're all doing these maladaptive things to cope. And so that would be number one, is recognize there's a problem and the way that you're dealing with it is not the best way to deal with it.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. So in this role, I had to scale back clinically because I'm doing a lot more administrative stuff. And when that happened, about a year, maybe 2 years after that happened, that door of that closet kind of burst open. And I started remembering all these cases that I had gone through over these years. It was weird. I would just all of a sudden just remember the kid that drowned and, the family reaction, all these things, or like, a really bad case at, whatever. And I remember kind of sitting there going, how do I deal with this? Like, how do I process through this? And I would talk to my wife, but it's hard if someone's not in medicine. It's hard. They don't really get it on the same level, at least. They're there for us. And then it's also hard because I think in our specialty, we don't really, like I think back to like what I would say to a colleague. I'd be like, well, that's just part of our job. Just deal with it, So I actually started, I guess it's a form of therapy. I started writing down. I started kind of writing these stories out. It's actually been helpful for me to kind of process through it a little bit. But it's interesting that you talk about that because I think that's the exact maladaptive strategy I fell into. Was I'm going to put this back in this storage room closet and I'm going to deal with it at some point. And then all of a sudden it started grabbing my attention. It's like time to deal with it, So I think that's true, and I don't know that I would have dealt with it if I didn't have more downtime off of shift, because I think I was doing that exact thing. Like you say, how do you deal with working too much? You work more, that way you don't have to think about it, which is also a horrible strategy.
Yeah. Well, and Sal, you mentioned one that I think is, in particular for shift work. So EMS, emergency medicine, fire, police, sleep. Like our specialty is very disruptive to any kind of normal sleep pattern. What are some successful strategies? I know people are like work isolated nights or batch nights or do this, but that's helpful, but that doesn't change the fact that there's still life going on and you still, you want to be a part of your family and, there's and everything else. Like any tips on sleep?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to tell you, and we're going to get to priorities and boundaries, but one of my top priorities in life is sleep now. So let me just kind of set the stage here. I'm going to make a statement and then I'm going to walk you through the logistics of it, and then I'll give you my strategies. But 1/3 of our life should be 1/3 of your entire life should be spent sleeping. I'm just curious what your all's reaction is to that statement.
Sounds like a lot of wasted time. No.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly right.
Exactly right.
What was it? You could sleep when you're dead. Isn't that the phrase?
That's right.
Yeah.
That was the phrase from Residency.
There's a fate worse than death, is what I would tell you. And sleep is one of those things that will make the fate worse than death, which is living with depression, living with burnout, not being able to work, being broken down, being sued because you're jaded. Like there's a fate worse than death. And so let me put it to you this way. So, and the average human should sleep 8 hours a day, a night, whatever you want to talk about. And how do you get to that? Well, there's two types of sleep. I mean, I'm not going to belabor you with all the details, but there's REM and non-REM sleep, right? REM sleep is our restorative sleep. And each cycle of REM, non-REM sleep is about 90 minutes. And as you go through more cycles, the amount of REM you get goes up. And it turns out that after 5 cycles, which if you do the math is about 7 to 9 hours, is where you get your restorative sleep. And so when you think about it in that context, and how many nights, days, etc., did you get less than that?
Yeah.
Working on 2 hours, working on 4 hours consistently, right? Like it's not like a one-off. It's like consistently, like that's the life we live. And it's a wonder like why so many people are so just not happy and so just fried. Why there's so much medical illness, why so many people are leaving the specialty. There's been a huge outflux of people from the specialty for many of these reasons. And so sleep is one of those things that it's like, hey man, this is when I'm supposed to be like recuperating and restoring myself. And it's the thing that I don't appreciate enough. And it's, in terms of boundaries, the thing that I let more things bleed into it. So how often do you stay up at night watching some Netflix series or something on TV or scrolling through social media when you should just go to bed? We're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it as well. But you're not really like helping yourself for the long run when you do stuff like that. It's a form of distraction is what you're doing to not deal with whatever you want to not deal with. And so I've taken all electronics out of my room. Everything. My phone doesn't sit on my bedstand. It sits on the chest of drawers across the room. And it's put on silent so that I'm less likely to want to get out of bed to go get on my phone. So on purpose. But with that, what I'll tell you is there are some tips and tricks that you can do to help with sleep. But I think sleep should be a priority, especially for those of us who do shift work. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that you want to make sure you're in a room where the temperature is like a little bit on the cooler side. If you've ever been sick and had a fever at night, how many times do you wake up in the middle of the night because you feel hot? And so it just turns out that we tend as humans to like things on the cooler side. It gives us better sleep, better comfort. And so you want your temperature well controlled in whatever environment you're in.
Just wait till you have a wife who goes through menopause.
The second thing is I used to drink a lot of alcohol when I was younger, a lot, like a ton. Like I may even call myself an alcoholic, the amounts that I was able to put down. But what I didn't realize is that although alcohol helps you fall asleep faster, it doesn't give you that deep sleep, that restorative REM sleep. And so I've been very, very careful now about alcohol intake and trying to ensure that at least at night, I am not drinking a ton of alcohol anymore. Actually, it's super rare that I ever drink alcohol. Again, I have more adaptive strategies now on how I deal with stress and those sorts of things. And alcohol is not one of those crutches. But alcohol does disrupt REM sleep. And so if you're drinking on more days than not, you're disrupting your sleep. So I'm not saying don't ever go out and have a drink. I'm just saying just be careful with how much and how often you consume. Caffeine. Caffeine can last up to 6 hours. This has been one of the hardest ones for me. is you're supposed to stop drinking all forms of caffeine 6 hours before you go to bed, because it can actually be additive, and it can impact the depth of your sleep as well. And so this has been one of the hardest ones for me, is to like limit the amount of caffeine as I'm getting closer to the end of a shift. Electronics, I've already talked about. You're supposed to stay off electronics for like 1 to 2 hours. We all know the bright lights and how it triggers things in your brain and makes you less likely to go to sleep. The final thing, or next to final thing, is I have a journal that I have next to my bed. It's old school paper and pen. And if I find that there's something in my head that I keep perseverating about it, that's keeping me awake, I write it down in that journal so that it's now out of my brain and I'm actually able to wind down and go to sleep. And then the final thing, and this was probably the best thing I ever spent money on, looking back on it, was I bought blackout blinds.
Yeah.
I completely blacked out my room so that it doesn't matter if I'm sleeping during the day or I'm sleeping at night. I have a completely dark, quiet room. Now, if you don't have money to go buy blackout blinds, you can pin up blankets. They make these eye covers that you can put on your eyes to kind of mimic
Cover all
that.
the windows in aluminum foil. That'll also get some police attention. But
Yeah, like a meth lab.
So, and then the last thing is I've started doing 5 minutes or 10 minutes of box breathing in my room, dark room that I have blacked out, that's quiet at a cooler temperature, for about 5 or 10 minutes, trying to clear my head. And that has been a huge something I've added recently that has made a huge difference in terms of how fast I fall asleep. So these are just some strategies that like have worked for me, things that have science to support them. And I hope people find them helpful. I hope you guys find them helpful. I don't know if any resonate with you, but again, restorative sleep by definition is 8 hours on average. And it's the thing we don't pay attention to. You know, we talk about physical health, we talk about mental health, but we don't talk about sleep health or sleep hygiene. And so this is that I reinvested myself in, and has been all the different how I feel now day to day.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember reading about the first time I heard about box breathing was they were using it in the Navy SEALs when they would like put them on a plane and say, okay, you've got 4 hours before we're getting off, breathe, do this. And I remember thinking, could that really help that much? But like, there is some research behind a lot of these things.
Yeah. Sal, have you ever read Lieutenant Grossman's book On Combat?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because, the physiologic response to maximum stress, which I think, obviously the military and active warfare fits that category. But I would say the ER can be a very stressful place as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't have to go that far. I mean, COVID was a mass casualty event, whether you want to accept that or not. But literally people were coming in suffocating. Everything was locked down. They were dying by themselves in hordes, like 6 to 10 deaths a day, no matter what you did for a 2-year period. Yeah. That's basically going into combat, right? Not knowing your enemy, not having enough stuff to deal with it, like not enough tests, not enough PPE, you name it. And complete strangers holding your hand as they're dying and not getting to see their families. Like for 2 years, we dealt with that. And I think it really jacked up a lot of people. It jacked me up. And so not too far off from combat, is what I'm going to say. It may have not been bullets that were killing people, but same effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what else? So you had mentioned earlier about boundaries, and I'm really interested to hear what you say about that, because I feel like I've tried to do that in the past, and then I get kind of overridden by guilt. I say, okay, I need this. And then that lasts a couple of days. Then I say, no, my family needs to come first. Or, well, I tell my wife, honey, I got to take this call. It's from work, and then before you know it, I'm right back to where I was, even though I had good intentions of setting boundaries.
So can I start off with like a little story, and then from there I'll tell you exactly, I'll give you the explicits on priorities and boundaries, because I hate the phrase work-life balance. There's no such thing. It's work-life decisions. The decisions you make have consequences, which lead to an imbalance or a balance in your life. So imagine you have a jar, an empty jar, that's your life. Okay. Your life is this empty jar. And you have big rocks, which are family and friends. You have pebbles, which would be work. And then you have sand, which is distractions, is everything else, is email, social media, you name it. Okay. And you take your jar, and I think most of us have the best intentions. We're going to put the big rocks in first, right? So we're going to focus on family and friends. Now, if I asked you, is that jar full? What would you say?
No.
Well,
not totally.
No, because you can put pebbles in there, right? There's room for pebbles, which is like work. And then after you do work, family, friends, and work, and I say, is the jar full? What would you say?
Still room for sand.
Still room for sand, right? Now, if you reverse roles and you fill the jar with sand first, there's no room for the big rocks and the pebbles. And so this is where priorities and boundaries came in for me. And I don't remember where I read that little story, but like that was a really like aha moment for me of like, I've been putting the wrong things in my jar first. I've got this completely backwards. And I'll give you an example here. When you look at your calendar, is your calendar filled with a bunch of work stuff, meetings and shifts? Or is it filled with a lot of personal stuff, family and friends? And all you have to do is look at the snapshot of your calendar and what you put in it, and that tells you what you're prioritizing. And that will be the reality of what your life is. And if it's all meetings and work, that's what your life's going to be, is meetings and work. If you actually prioritize things and put those priorities in the calendar, now your life starts to look more like a blend of what you actually envisioned for yourself. And so that's why the jar story, because I feel like we do a bad job of, one, listing what our priorities are, and two, setting healthy boundaries. So let's take those one at a time. So every 6 months, I sit down and on a 5x8 index card, I write down what my 3 priorities in my life are. And I post that on the mirror in my bathroom, because every morning when I get up, I go and wash my face, I brush my teeth, and it is a daily reminder to me before I start my day, what are the big rocks in my life? And for me, that is going to be my family and friends. That's going to be diet and exercise and sleep. Those are like non-negotiables for me anymore. I will not let anything bleed into those. That means everything else comes secondary. And so I make sure in my calendar, those priorities are the first things I'm putting in my calendar, and everything else is working around that. Now, I think it's important that we don't prioritize what's on our schedule in terms of work and meetings, but instead to schedule our priorities. And somehow, somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. And I think a lot of us lose sight of that because we just keep putting all this like business stuff, but we don't put personal stuff. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is you just need to take a minute and you need to decide what are the most important things to you in your life. Those are the big rocks. Those are the things that need to get scheduled into your calendar first. Everything else comes secondary. No guilt. No guilt.
So Sal, that I'm a big fan of that. You know, you're controlling your calendar controls your life. But I think what I've noticed is you have to be intentional, right? Like you said, you got to do the 5x8 card, or like I said, I've got a whiteboard here and I've got something with a magnet stuck on it. It's like, what are my personal goals? And approaching my family like I would approach running a business. Like, it sounds maybe corny, but it's like, what are our priorities? And then how do we be intentional about setting those aside, because if you don't think about it, then time passes and it's filled with all the pebbles and sand. We had a friend about 2 years ago die of pancreatic cancer. She was 60 when she died, and she told everybody to say that she was 59, because everybody say 59, oh, she's so young. But if you're in the 60s, it's like, oh, she had a good life. So she wanted to be 59. And she died well. And she was very intentional with that time that she had. But that was a pivotal thing for me. Like, time is finite. So last week, my wife and I hiked the Grand Tetons. I'm going to take my wife and we're going to go fly fishing. And then, my wife's always wanted to do German Christmas market. So you know what? We're going to find a way to fit these rocks in. So yeah, I think, but it took more work than I anticipated about being intentional with my personal time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that, we be more explicit with what our big rocks are, and then making sure that, like you said, intentional about those big rocks. Otherwise, time goes by and you can't get it back, and it's too late. It's gone.
And I would venture to say, if we asked a bunch of our colleagues, hey, what are your personal goals for you and your family? What's your personal mission statement? I would say 80% will be like, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll be completely candid here. I'm looking at my calendar. I've got it sitting right in front of me. I only have work stuff on there. In fact, you raised a really good point, and that's going to be something I'm going to take away from this discussion is in my mind, I kind of have my work stuff and then I fit in my life around it. But that's exactly what you're talking about, this kind of farce of work-life balance. It's like, no, I need to get better about setting aside time and saying this is family time. If there's an emergency, that's one thing, but it's kind of that always being on the clock. That is what I found has really drained me. So that's great advice. I think I think that will resonate with a lot of providers and a lot of docs and PAs that are working with us for sure.
And then the second part of this was boundaries, right? And there's something called an Eisenhower matrix. Are you guys familiar with the Eisenhower matrix? It's basically a 2x2 box, and across the top there's two categories: urgent, not urgent, and then across the side it's important, not important. And this is an activity I strongly urge people to do, because this is what's allowed me to set boundaries on things. And I'm going to give you some very specific examples. But at the top left, if you can imagine in this matrix, it's urgent and it's important. That means I have to do it now, right? These are things that have deadlines. And unfortunately, a lot of things that have deadlines are related to work, not related to life stuff. Unless you make it a point to make it a deadline for life stuff. Then the next box over is not urgent and important. And these are things that you can schedule and plan. There's no deadline. And this is life stuff. And this is where a lot of my big rocks were falling. They weren't in deadline stuff. They were in the no deadline stuff, but they were equally as important. And so this is where I started being very specific and the way I wanted my life to look in terms of scheduling my big rocks into my calendar. And I really urge people to do this. Then if we come down catty corner, it's under urgent, not important. And I'll tell you, like, I always felt guilty having somebody come and clean my house once a week or doing yard work for me, but that's all time. And I've just finally gotten to a point where, like, I've learned that it's okay to delegate some things that I don't enjoy, that are important, right? But they're just not important to me. And if you enjoy cleaning, then by all means, don't delegate it. But that's just an example of like yard work and cleaning the house. I'm not a messy person. I do my laundry. I clean as much as I can, but it's nice to have somebody come and just kind of run through with a fine tooth comb and just clean it up even more. So these are just things that I delegate. And then the last box at the bottom is not urgent, not important. And these are basically all distractions, right? And these are things we need to limit, delete, whatever that may be. So one way I've gotten off social media is I've killed all push notifications on my phone. Some people go as extreme as just removing social media apps off their phones. Um, I've just learned to silence things. And I think there's only a couple of people that can call me and the phone will actually ring. Otherwise it's off, like it's on quiet. And so I'm just not being distracted. Work. I think you already alluded to this, but if I asked you what's more important, time or money, you said time. And I agree, because time is finite, money is infinite. I can always make more money. Finances is another thing we haven't even talked about, but that's a whole separate discussion for another day. But to me, time has become the more valued thing, not making more money. I mean, after you make $100,000, how much do you really need? Now, I understand people have kids, they got to put them through college, there's different things, but you create your own reality. If you go out and buy the hottest new car and update your technology every time something new comes out, that's all fixed cost. Well, guess what? You got to work to pay for that fixed cost. And so maybe just taking a step back and just getting away from that instant gratification of buying something and just living like a normal person. Maybe you don't have to work as much.
Yeah.
So
being debt free and living below your means gives you a lot of freedom.
100%. And that's the thing, is a lot of us come out and we want to buy a new car and we want to buy the big mansion and we want to have season tickets to this and we want a boat and we want a cabin and we want all these things. And what ends up happening is you're 80 and you're still working 20 shifts a month.
Yeah.
Yep.
You talked about deleting stuff off your phone. This book right here, Make Time.
Yep.
Like, these are guys that worked for Google, right? And did YouTube and these things. They took stuff off their phone. They got rid of email off their phone. They got rid of Facebook off their phone. Because they saw what it was doing to their lives. And these are the guys that, helped write some of the software.
Developed it.
Yeah. So I thought,
Again,
it's very telling.
It starts with priorities first, and then realizing what your big rocks are and what the sand is. And what you quickly realize is social media, email, all these things are sand. But yet we all waste our days, nights doing them. I remember being... Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, you say it's sand, and it's true. But if you were to take anybody's phone and look at their screen time on there, I mean, it's shocking. Hours and hours people spend on these things that are really in that box of non-urgent, non-important. And then, at the end of the day, you're frazzled and you say, well, I didn't get to my, my important thing list, and I haven't talked to my son or whatever. And it's like, but it's funny how there's a default to that. There's a pull to that is, unless you're intentional, I think that's the flow of the river that we're in now.
It's funny. I don't think people realize this statement. It's not like a brilliant statement, but it's true. For everything you say yes to, you just said no to something else. And so every time you say yes to sand, you're saying no to pebbles and big rocks. So it's just something to think about. I think the first step is deciding what those priorities are for you, and it's going to be different for every person. And then I think it's making sure that your calendar looks more reflective of what your big rocks are in your life. And then I think it's getting rid of things that are distracting and delegating things that you don't need to actually do yourself. And that's how you set boundaries that are long lasting. It's not, I want to quit smoking and then I keep falling off the wagon, or I want to quit drinking and I keep falling off the wagon. That's a different conversation. I'm just talking about life. And I think most people don't take the time to sit down to decide what their priorities are, and they don't put them into their calendars in such a way that life now bleeds in and work is now the superset of life instead of the subset as it should be.
Yeah, I think if you can learn to use your calendar as a strategic weapon, right? It can be a powerful, powerful tool. But kind of like Sal said, I think you need to analyze your week or your month. and block those times on your calendar that are important and protect them. Again, like Joel, you said, life will throw you emergencies on occasion. Like there's a car wreck or, family members sick. There's always going to be something that can disrupt the apple cart. But overall, putting that on the calendar and protecting it and making it sacrosanct, right? Like, so if I put something on there, it should be non-negotiable. Don't double book. Like, just like, this is the time my wife and I are going to the movie. Like,
yeah, your kid's got a recital or a soccer game or something that goes in the calendar. Goes in the calendar. I can't work a shift that day because my kid's got a game. Like, that's one of my priorities. That's one of my big rocks. You know what I mean? And so zero guilt. You
can always pick up another shift, but you can't get those
100%.
games and recitals back. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Those, once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah, but people struggle. Like, there's the guilt of like, all right, we know we're short shift. Everybody's pulling it. Like,
yeah.
And this is where it's like, it's. I'd love to build more resiliency in our staffing, but it's a tight market. It's tricky.
Yeah, but it is interesting, Eric. I reached out to Sal probably, I guess, 6 months ago, and I said, hey, would you have any interest in doing a conference for our docs? We got about 150 docs and on staff, not all are full time, and about 100 PA or APPs. And I said, we'd love to have you fly out and do something. And he sent me a very, very nice email back, but it had some boundaries. He said, I'm not doing as much travel. I'm not doing as much on-site stuff because it's just too much to take on with life, work, and all these other things. And the response was, I thought, very, very reasonable. Yeah. And although, we would love to have him out, the reality is that, yeah, you just pick up all these things and the way he explained it, I was like, okay, that's a boundary that he set. It makes sense.
No, it's like I don't know if you've Michael Hyatt.
Oh yeah,
Focus.
Oh yeah, I've read that book. That's a great book.
Yeah, so the default is no. Your default should be no, right? And be nice about it, but your default is no. And then if you find value and it's important, you can always make it a yes. But
so the guilt part, again, I think it's guilt because you haven't defined what your priorities are. Once you've defined what your priorities are, the guilt part goes away because your focus is your priorities. And so for me, before I started setting priorities for myself, I was a yes man. I would say yes to everything. And I would pick up the worst shifts and the worst times, the busiest times. And at the end of the day, there's how many ever other people in your practice. Like, you don't have to solve the weight of the world's problems. You just need to do your part, but you also need to live your life. Mm-hmm. And I think once you define what your priorities are, and I think for most people, family and friends, I hope, are like up there, you start feeling less guilty. You feel more guilty about the recital you missed, or the game that you didn't make, or date night that you didn't have with your wife, or the vacation that you won't get back because your kids, once they turn 18 and go off to college, like, your window is limited with them. You can't get that back. And so once you define what your priorities are, the guilt actually flips. You feel more guilty for missing family stuff than you feel guilty for not working a shift. Because there's always more shifts to pick up. They never stop, just like patients.
Yeah, yep. I seriously doubt I'm going to be on my deathbed and think, boy, I wish I worked more shifts.
Yeah. Wish I would have made a little bit more money,
Yeah, rather than like, I wish I'd taken that trip with the kids, right? Yeah.
Yeah. We've all been at the side of a deathbed, and I've never heard anybody say, I wish I would have worked more. But we've heard a lot of other things about family and priorities and that kind of thing. So that's a great reminder, and I think that's a great message to get out to our people.
All right, so Sal, I've kept you on longer than I was supposed to, and so if I'm going to ask for the last parting piece of wisdom that you'd like to share, is there, or a summary of things that you thought were most important? What is your final one shot?
So I would say the three things you need to focus on is your coping strategies, with how you deal with the stresses of work. Number two is putting more emphasis on your sleep and sleep hygiene. And number three is your priorities and boundaries that you set for yourself. And if I could leave you with one parting thought, it's 20 years from now, the only people that will remember you worked late or that you worked at all will be your family and friends. Nobody else will remember that you did that you picked up that extra shift or that you stayed late. So that would be my parting thought.
That's a great thought, because you're exactly right. That is simple but profound.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Sal, this was a blast. I really appreciate talking to you. I hope a lot of people are able to incorporate some of this, and to get intentional. I think it can be transformative. So.
I don't mean this as a self-promotion thing. It's free, like most of the things I do, but I have a YouTube channel called @Rezaie Strong. It's all one word, REZAIE Strong. And my sole purpose for that channel is focusing on many of the things we talked about today, but other things as well, that have to do with personal growth, mental growth, emotional growth, spiritual growth. It kind of goes through a lot of these things, lots of little videos, little shorts, quotes that I've come across. And so if people have more interest in learning about this stuff, it's a free site. It costs nothing. All you have to do is subscribe, just like I do with Rebel EM. It costs nothing. It's free. I think it's a philanthropic thing to do. And as I'm learning and going along, that's where I'm putting a lot of this stuff. So if people have more interest, they should definitely check out the YouTube channel.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that is in the description on this one as well. So
yeah, that'll be great.
Well, Joel, thanks for reaching out to Sal.
Yeah, thank you, Sal, for taking the time. We really appreciate it. It's been an honor to talk to you.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. This is a topic that I'm obviously very passionate about. I could talk for 5 hours on this stuff, but I don't want to bore everybody.
No, I think it's. I agree. This is a super important thing. It's nice that people are having the conversation, and it's very fascinating. Some of these heroes of emergency medicine that we get to talk, like Rob Orman's got a similar focus on, how do you not get crushed in this particular profession that we've chosen, So, all right. Well, thanks again. I much appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. This was fun.
All right. Thank you.